Friends, let's begin today with our discussion on the second most important issue that Aristotle discussed in tragedy, that is characters. And we have seen there are four requirements Aristotle discussed, where we yesterday talked about first, second, and fourth requirement that Aristotle discussed. And we stopped at the point that the third requirement is more difficult. And this more difficult fourth requirement of a third requirement of character, why it seems to be a little bit difficult, why it is said that this third requirement is difficult. The reason is Aristotle says that the character should be like, and in Greek like is called as homoios, homoios. Homoios means like what? Because like requires something, some object. Now Aristotle has used this word twice before in connection with the characters. In chapter number 13, he says that fear is felt someone like us. And in chapter number 2 also, he uses the phrase for people of the same sort as ourselves. They are as distinct from those better and worse than we are. But this creates a problem, my friends, because in chapter number 2, Aristotle says that tragedy is concerned with people better than we are, while chapter number 13 indicates that tragedy's distinctive emotional response is concerned with people like ourselves. And a passage at the end of chapter number 15 also points out to the resolution of apparent inconsistency in the people. Now, when Aristotle is continuously using this word homoios, where the translators, editors, analysis or analyst of his essay, the people who analyze his essay, they follow these type of words like us, what we are, someone like us. Now, what exactly Aristotle wants to compare with when he's saying like us means what sort of comparison Aristotle wants? What sort of comparison Aristotle is expecting from the audiences, from the readers? With whom he is comparing all these things? And there we find that Aristotle compares poets to portrait painters. poets to portrait painters. For the portrait painters, Aristotle says that they paint people as they are, but make them better looking. You have seen all the paintings. Usually, the paintings nowadays you have an technology, a technology of camera, and you can edit it and you can make the picture and the things more beautiful than it looks like. But during the time of Aristotle, there were no cameras. So portrait painters used to portray the things and they used to portray the person as it is, but they make them more beautiful in their paintings. There is, you can say, therefore, a combination of likeness and idealization in any portrait or portraiture, we can say. The portraits which are made, the portraits are like that person. Yeah, like he looks like about this particular person, but we don't know whether this person is this much beautiful or not because it is an idealized version of that particular person. Because when you are portraying something, you need to make it refined. You need to make it a little bit beautiful. That's why it's an ideal portrait. Now, a painter might keep Cromwell's words beautiful. He can make it less ugly, or in real sense, if those words are ugly and disliked by many people in the society, in painting, in making the portrait of for Cromwell, he can make that particular, he can remove that ugliness little bit with using his own ideas into it. He can remove this certain uh, unlikeliness of that particular character, that particular person in the society in his paintings, so that in future, whosoever will see that will feel that he is such type of an ideal person. So in portraiture, likeness and idealization both comes together. There is a combination of these two things. Aristotle, when saying about characters that they like to be like this, they have to be like this. How a character should be in a tragedy? A character should be like a portrait painter painting a character should be a combination of likeness and idealization. If a character is been portrayed from a real life, where you will find out that this particular character, this particular person who is portrayed in the tragedy, the poet, the dramatist, the tragedy poet, the poet who writes tragedy needs to refine and chisel the character appearing in the tragedy. That is the responsibility of the tragic poet, that he should take care of character. If he is ugly in his real life, when he is appearing on the stage, this ugliness might be little less. He should not be more ugly than his real life, so that the audience can able to like it. Likeness and idealization. Please remember these two words. Every character presented in tragedy should carry a likeness and idealization. And that's why you will find out, my friend, that Aristotle is pointing out that in the same way as the portrait painter paints a portrait of a person who actually in his life is ugly, this ugliness can be made less in the portrait with the concept of likeness and idealization. In the same way, characters can be made better in tragedy. Characters can be made better than we are, because we may not have that added qualities into us. But Aristotle is expecting that when tragic poet tries to sketch the character, tries to bring the character into existence, at that time he has to think that he can make a character better than we are. Now you may say when a dramatist is sketching a character or is creating a character who is better than uh, us, then what about his imperfections? Because what he said in the earlier discussions about the character, that he should not be so virtuous, he should be a combination of all the elements. He should be virtuous, he should be a little bit hypocrite, he should be a little bit bad, because not all the persons are virtuous in their own real life. So there may be certain imperfection in that. And that is what, again, when he says that he should make a little bit better, but he should make a little bit better with certain imperfections into it. Because if he is too virtuous, then the change in fortune will take a little bit of trouble to convince the audience that this man who is too virtuous faced the problem. People will say, yes, because he's too virtuous, he has to face the problem. If he's like us, who are not so much virtuous, but we used to change ourselves at certain situations, we behave as per the situation allows us to behave. If he will behave like this, he will not face the problem. So the object of tragedy to evoke pity and fear will not take place if he is too virtuous. That's why he should be combination of all those things. So when a tragedy poet is creating a character, it is important that this character should be better than what we are, but carry some imperfections into it. And if they are carrying some imperfections into it, there will be these types of characters who are a combination of the two things, will be appreciated by the audience very much. Audience will like them. The tragic poet should not fall into the trap of making it too much ideal, as it is a large possibility, a big possibility with portrait painters, because he wants to make it ideal. But a tragic poet need not to think about making it ideal. The idea of idealization is not suitable for a character in any tragedy. You should not say he is an ideal character to follow in the life. No. In tragedy, we are not following the character. We are following the sort of behavior that has taken place in the life of that character. And that's why those incidences make us to feel that yes, we have also gone through this particular condition. And that's why the audience started to like it. And that's why the tragic poet, while creating a character, should think about this, and that is why I said it is little more difficult to understand, because it is somehow, you will find out, it is uh, shifting. If you hear this debate, if you learn this debate, if you understand this argument first, and then if you are reading with the rest of the arguments, you will feel that there is a contradiction. Aristotle is following some sort of contradiction into his own statements. And that's why what we have to decide, what we have to understand, that when he's telling that he should be like us, because like us conveys us so many things, that when you say he is like us, that means he is not an idealized person to follow. He is a combination of likeness and idealization, but this likeness and idealization are related with common person, not like a portrait painter. That is what we have to understand it. And this, if you understand this in a very proper way, this third requirement which we said we will discuss it today. Now this third requirement which we are talking today, this third requirement makes us to understand that Aristotle has certain perfect understanding of creating a character in tragedy. Now he would agree in chapter number 13 that tragic characters are to be virtuous, as we said, but this virtuosity should not be outstanding. It should not be so much virtuous, as we already discussed in chapter number 13. And that's why when he says the characters should be like, and then we asked a question at the beginning, like what? The character should be like us, because we are not completely virtuous. And that's what a very, very common, uh, you can say, saying. That is not a saying in most of the time when people used to say to err is human. If you are virtuous, you are not going to commit any error. And if you are not committing any error, then you are not human. In biblical sense, God created angels who will not commit any sort of errors, but humans are supposed to commit errors. That's why humans are not going to be so virtuous as compared to. And this is how we have to understand that Aristotle has tried to bring out character in such a way that this character should not be so virtuous. He should be virtuous, but not so outstanding. Now, if he is not so outstanding, if they are like us, in that if they fall short of some moral perfection, whose downfall we would find outrageous, but they still tend to better rather than worse. If this would happen with a common person who committed same type of mistake, he will face some different sort of punishment in his life. But the tragic character who commits the same sort of mistake can get punishment, but it is better than the worst punishment that he will get in his life. And that's why we need to understand that the moral perfection of the character, when he will fall down, it will make us little bit, we should find ourselves outrageous at that time. But the fall should be better than the worse. That is how idealization, which the portrait painter used to follow in his painting. So Aristotle is pointing out this particular thing very categorically. This is the third requirement of character. The earlier three requirements, because Aristotle talked about the four requirements of character, of which first, second, and fourth we have discussed yesterday. The third one, which is remaining, we talked it today. Now, if you see the discussion about characters that we have initiated yesterday, as compared to the discussion about plot, you will find that Aristotle has analyzed the plot with a more space allocated to it than compared to character. The analysis of character as compared to plot seems to be superficial at one level. He's talking about certain ideal, certain things of that particular characters. He has not analyzed in detail as he tried to analyze the idea of catharsis in detail, the idea of plot in detail, what kinds of plots are there, how plots are different, what is simple plot, what is complex plot, what are the ideal things that should be part of complex plot, what are the things that are not in simple plot. He discussed all those things, but he has not discussed anything more about the characters except how these characters should be placed into the tragedy. Instead of that, he has not discussed anything, he has not analyzed anything in detail, or maybe possible that he has analyzed it, but those pages are not with us today. And that's why it seems most of the time that Aristotle's analysis of characters seems to be superficial. Now, the way Aristotle discussed plot, the way Aristotle pointed out about plot so seriously, we need to understand very important fact that Aristotle at least has given some chance to discuss, Aristotle has given some chance to discuss the plot in detail, talked about characters in detail, but Aristotle has not at all given much more chance to the third part of tragedy. If you remember the third constituent of tragedy, the first is plot, second is character, and third constituent of tragedy, if you remember, is reasoning. And Aristotle has treated this third part of tragedy, reasoning, almost parenthetically. He has not discussed it in detail. Although almost in a parenthesis that you explain something in a short. In the same fashion, he discussed about reasoning in chapter number 19. Now, here we find that the concept has undergone a degree of expansion. In chapter number 6, when he discussed about this reasoning and character, he paired the things together as the base of, as the two bases of action. For action, these two things are required: character and reasoning. And we have seen the example of cowardness, how we are coward. If I am a coward and perceive the current situation as dangerous, then I'm likely to run away from that position. Both my moral disposition as I'm a cowardice and my understanding of the situation enter into the motivation of action. That is what we have discussed by getting an example of a cockroach and a roller coming on the street. Now, more formally, reasoning was defined in chapter number 6 in terms of demonstrating that something is or is not the case, or making a general statement about it. the agent's understanding of the current situation is revealed by what he or she says, or you can say an assertion of or denial about particular situation, that the situation in which I am staying is dangerous, the situation in which I am staying is not safe, or a general statement that it is dangerous to sit in front of a moving steamroller. This is a very general statement, a very general example. But when Aristotle talks about reasoning in chapter number 19, Aristotle brings out the elements of assertion, denial, and generalization are part of reasoning, are still present in the discussion in chapter number 19, but he added some more things into this, because in chapter number 6 we have seen these three things: assertion, denial, and generalization. Assertion, as I am cordis, because I saw a mouse and I shouted and ran away from that particular place. This shows that I am a cordis. I have seen that a steamroller or road roller is coming towards me, and still I am staying there without getting away from that road or without getting away from that place, that you are denying the danger. And a very general statement that I am in, it is dangerous to sit in front of this particular road roller. These are the three types of general behavior reasonings causes. Now he includes reason, certain things into chapter number 19 when he talks about reasoning, and that's why we said he has not discussed reasoning in detail when he talks about reasoning. Or as I am saying it continuously, that all it may be possible that he has uh, discussed those things in detail, but we did not get those pages. No one ever was able to find out those pages. May be possible, because that's why most of the critics and analysts used to say that the poetics is incomplete in itself. Now, reasoning here in chapter number 19 includes speech, in which the characters arouse emotions, or the characters make the things look important or unimportant. This is what he has added into reasoning in chapter number 19. It depends on the speech of the character, that how he uses his speech, because this speech can arouse the emotions, or his speech can make the things important or unimportant. It totally depends on the speech of that particular character. And reasoning is also dependent on this speech. In other words, it has extended to cover all the ways in which a tragedy, one person, how he uses language in tragedy to influence another one. He uses that trick, that how this character uses language to influence other person in a tragedy. So he has added speech into reasoning in this chapter number 19. It includes now not just to observe that it is dangerous to sit in front of a road roller, but also the persuasive devices which the character might use to frighten another with the prospect of sitting in front of a road roller, or to convince him that it is something very dangerous, that you are taking these things very lightly. It is not essential to convince the person by putting him in front of a road roller to get the real feeling. Now, if you remember certain things, if you see certain things, when you read any tragedy, when you watch any tragedy, certain things are usually taking place out of the stage. We call it as off stage activities. What happened there, we have not seen it, but we try to understand it. The fight between Oedipus and his father, it is offstage fight. You only get a message that King Laos died in a fight with Oedipus. We have not seen the fight on stage in front of audiences. So, and a very simple example for us to understand. If you are not remembering Oedipus, if you want to convince a person in your real life about certain dangerous things in his life, you are not asking that person to stand in front of that particular danger so that he can experience it. What you do, you use certain incidences with use of your language to convince that person that if you are in this particular situation, you will face such type of danger. That means here you are using language as the tool to convince that particular person about the danger that he may face if he falls it in real life. And that is why you will find out, my friends, that Aristotle has tried to use this technique, but again we can say that this technique is part of rhetorics. And Aristotle has not used rhetorics anyway in convincing to the readers that tragedy should also use rhetorics in convincing or influencing the audiences, or to evoke their emotions of pity and fear by the help of rhetorics. No, he has not used rhetorics, but this is the technique what you can call it as a rhetoric. You're using some tool, you are using something to convince the people. And with this short analysis of reasoning, he tries to point out, he tries to talk about this third constituent of tragedy of the six. Now, if you move from reasoning, again it is getting short in explaining that language which conveyed the reasoning. Because if you see, the next part of, or the next constituent of tragedy is diction. And from chapter number 19 through to chapter number 22, which is concerned with diction, this may makes us to think that Aristotle has given a little bit of more space, little bit of more space in view of the comparatively low importance which Aristotle attaches to the poet's function as a maker of verses, as distinct from maker of poets. Aristotle has given very, you can say, not complete space, but a generous space to them. Because diction, because if you remember, when we talked about this six constituents of tragedy, where when we talked about diction, we said one particular thing that uh, verse or the poet, there are two types: verse and lyrics, songs. And Aristotle is saying that he's trying to point out poets' role in writing verse and lyrics. Now, on the closer inspection of these chapter 19 to 22 in Poetics, the material in these chapters does not seem so opposite, because most of the analysts used to say that chapter number 20 is nothing but a linguistic theory that Aristotle is trying to propagate with no particular bearing on poetry. He's not giving any detailed analysis of poetry, but he's giving only linguistic theory, a sort of linguistic theory in chapter number 20. Or chapter number 21 is more directly relevant, because chapter number 21 classifies various kinds of departure from standard discourse of writing. And he even talks in the next chapter about such type of departures from standard discourse of writing, because there is a standard way of writing language, standard discourse is there. You're shifting from standard discourse to some other kind of discourse in tragedy. So such type of departure from standard discourse, that such departures are in the form of linguistic norms, and these linguistic norms are characteristics of poetic language, because the sort of language used in tragedy is not a language of routine day-to-day life. So he's moving from day-to-day life's language to a very specified language, and this specified language is nothing but, you can say, a sort of characteristics of poetic language, because the specific linguistic norms have been used. But in chapter number 22, Aristotle strikingly does not concern with the diction of tragedy in particular, although he is using diction as one of the most important constituents of tragedy, but he is not speaking, he is not giving a detailed analysis of diction in tragedy particular. He is talking about diction in general. And that tempts us to infer that Aristotle's, what he's feeling, that something had to be said about poetic diction. The sort of poetic diction incorporated material which has conveniently handed over, and most of the time it was not ideally adapted to its context, what sort of context it has to be used in. That's why we need to understand that when Aristotle is talking about diction in chapter number 22, he is simply concerned with diction in writing verses and lyric, but he has not analyzed in detail about the diction used in tragedy, especially because it is important that in what context this language is appearing, what are the context where the language is coming. It has to match with the context. And the section on poetic language concludes Aristotle's discussions on tragedy. And then from chapter number 23, he turns towards the discussion on epic. But there is clearly some unfinished business here. Only four of the six constituents which he identified in chapter number 6 have been discussed. Lyric poetry and spectacle, these two things, these two constituents, he has given a lot of time to plot, little bit less time to character, then very less time to reasoning, and then very few words for diction. Not particularly diction in tragedy, diction in general. And the last two constituents, lyric poetry and spectacle, Aristotle has not paid any separate attention to it. What does this mean? That these two constituents, which are part of tragedy but not of that much importance, because lyric poetry is a combination of words and melody. Its verbal dimensions could convincingly seen, or you can say as treated implicitly in the chapters on poetic language. That's why he has not discussed lyric poetry when he's talking about poetic language. When he's talking about diction, he talked about that how lyric language should be. The language should not be. It should be departure from standard discourse, departure from linguistic norms, and the departure of linguistics norms are the characteristics of poetic language. That's means when he talked about poetic language, it means he has not given any specific attention to talk on lyric poetry because he has already said this. Since the focus is not restricted to spoken dramatic verse, the musical part of it or the melodious dimension is perhaps part passed over, thinking or considering or over the grounds that it is part of realization of tragic text in performance. It is a tragic text in performance. That's why he has not paid so much attention to it, because here this part is related with the performance more than the text. And here you cannot control. If I am if I've written certain text and if I've handed over to the actor to perform it, now I don't have any control over what the actor would perform at on the stage when the performance is going on. So it is not in the control of the tragic poet to explain that particular thing. And that's why Aristotle has not paid much more attention to this particular lyric poetry. And a similar consideration can be applied to spectacle also. As we have already seen, that Aristotle says at the end of chapter number 6 that spectacle is not a really integral part to the poet's art, or the tragic poet's job is to produce a text that can be performed on the stage. Performance itself is a separate matter. And as we have already discussed when we are talking about spectacle, that it depends on, in today's modern concept, it depends on the director. How this director will look after the things, how this director will define and design the things. And that's why it is not more related with the poet. And that's why you can say Aristotle has not paid much more attention towards these two things, because these two things are related with performance. As we can say that Aristotle was certainly aware of the potency of performance, and it is precisely that potency which tempts tragedians to rely on it. What is the potency of this particular plot to be performed on the stage? Whether this plot has certain potential to be accepted by the audience after the performance or not, because as I said you earlier, that drama requires performance, and performance is its integral part. If you're not accepting drama as having an integral part of performance into it, then we are not at all able to understand the potentiality of the drama to affect the audience on a large scale. And that's why, my friends, Aristotle, who pointed out that this potency tempts tragedians to rely on it, and this relying on this potency to perform, sometimes they neglect towards the plot. That is how Aristotle pointed out this tendency in chapter number 14 also, that to rely on the potency of the performance of tragedy makes most of the tragedians to neglect the plot. Sometimes it may leads towards neglecting the plot. The passage, the tendency which Aristotle talked in chapter number 14, that passage does not imply, please understand this particular thing. It does not imply that the use of spectacle to complement and enhance the effect of a well constructed plot is improper. And the comments at the beginning of chapter number 17 on need to visualize the action suggests that Aristotle recognized the importance of poets being aware of all these lacunas, and these poets will take steps to enhance by using spectacle in a very proper way to effect of his text in performance. One factor which may help to explain his reluctance to be more positive emerges in chapter number 26, which shows that the hostile critics of tragedy saw performance as one of the objectionable things about it. So Aristotle, as a defender of tragedy, has reason not to emphasize performance much, and that's why he has not discussed those two things very much. These are the different causes and reasons that Aristotle has not discussed lyric poetry and spectacle in detail in latter chapters. To reply to these critics, Aristotle argued that since tragedy can have its effect without being performed, it is not intrinsically more vulgar than epic. But apparently he goes on to make point that music and spectacle gives pleasure to the audience. Thus we can say, my friends, that concedes the objections to performance for the sake of argument. Please understand this. And shows that it does not entail inferiority of tragedy. He reserves his arguments and claims that performance is positive advantage. He reserves it. He has not said very clearly about it. However, we can see the oddity in the syntax of the Greek at this point, which has led some editors to conclude that the words and spectacle have been inserted in error. These are not part of Aristotle's discussion. Some critics, some scholars, some editors used to talk about that. They used to claim that latter copyists, latter editors has included these two things into Aristotle's text, but original text doesn't consist of these two words, diction, lyric poetry, and spectacle. They used to say that Aristotle mentioned only about music. So we cannot be sure that how positively Aristotle expresses himself about spectacle. It is somehow we have to think about the last two constituents of tragedy in this way. Friends, we have discussed all the six constituents of tragedy, four in detail and two what are the different arguments and what are the arguments that Aristotle laid and what are the other critics laid down argument about the use of those two words, lyric poetry and spectacle, how this Aristotle discussed and how other critics have commented that this is not part of the Aristotle's definition. Later on, people they have included those two words into it. All those arguments and debates. We are not entering into the debates in detail, but I have given a cursory look towards it so that you can able to understand it that these sorts of debates have taken place when you read the text or when you read other analysis from other sources. In that you can able to find out these types of arguments are taking place. Now we should not think that okay, with this discussion Aristotle may have finished the debate and discuss about tragedy. There are other miscellaneous aspects that Aristotle discussed about tragedy, and those other aspects, those miscellaneous aspects that Aristotle discussed in various chapters, we will discuss those miscellaneous aspects of tragedy that he discussed in various chapters. We'll collect it and we'll talk it in a lecture, in another lecture, in next lecture. And we'll see from chapter number 15 to 19 to 17 to 20 to 26 how he shifted towards different aspects of tragedy when he discusses the things. And that's why we'll go with this discussion on tragedy still uh, for for a couple of lectures, and then we'll finish the discussion on tragedy and we'll move to epic, and then we'll move to comedy, and then we'll stop the discussion on poetics. Probably, as I'm expecting this to be completed in this week, it is not possible, so it will run to the next week. Okay, so I hope that you got it and you understand it in a way that I'm trying to convince you, I'm trying to tell you. We'll discuss rest of the part in